Chioma never believed in fate until the night she asked the wrong boy to dance. The charity gala in Seoul's most exclusive hotel glittered with wealth she could only dream of, but she wasn't there to admire the champagne towers or designer gowns. She was there because her nursing scholarship depended on volunteering at events for special needs children, and tonight's fundraiser promised extra credit she desperately needed. The Nigerian student had exactly 3 months left before her visa expired, and failing this program meant going home to Lagos empty-handed, facing her mother's disappointed eyes after all the sacrifices made to send her abroad. She noticed him standing alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a young man maybe 19 or 20, dressed in an expensive suit that hung perfectly on his slim frame. While everyone else mingled and laughed, he stared at the city lights below, his fingers tapping a precise rhythm against his thigh. Something about his isolation called to her, reminded her of her younger brother back home who saw the world differently than everyone else. Chioma's training kicked in, recognizing the repetitive movement, the way he avoided eye contact when a waiter passed too close. She approached carefully, her burgundy dress swishing against her brown legs, her braids swept elegantly over one shoulder. The boy's eyes were still fixed on the window when she stopped beside him, close enough to speak but far enough not to invade his space. She didn't touch him or make sudden movements, just spoke softly in English with her thick Nigerian accent warming every word. She told him the lights were beautiful tonight, that she understood crowds could be overwhelming, and then she did something that would unravel her entire world. She asked if he wanted to dance, just one dance, somewhere quieter where the music wasn't so loud. His eyes finally met hers, dark and intelligent and surprised, and after a long moment, he nodded once. She took his hand gently, noting how he tensed at first contact, and led him to a secluded corner of the ballroom where the orchestra's melody drifted softer. They swayed slowly, Chioma humming along to the music, keeping her movements predictable and calm. The boy's tension gradually eased, and she caught the smallest smile at the corner of his mouth. For 5 perfect minutes she thought she was doing something good, something kind. Then the music stopped abruptly. The ballroom fell into suffocating silence. Chioma looked up to find a man striding toward them, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea, terror written across every face. He was tall for a Korean man, dressed in all black, his features carved from stone and ice. His eyes locked onto her hand still holding the boy's, and the temperature in the room plummeted. She didn't understand the rapid Korean he spoke, but she understood the universal language of fury that radiated from him like heat from a flame. Security surrounded her within seconds. The boy was pulled away from her, and panic flooded Chioma's veins as rough hands grabbed her arms. She tried to explain, tried to apologize, but the man in black held up one hand and everyone froze. He stepped closer, so close she could see the scar cutting through his left eyebrow, so close she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something dangerous. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke in perfect English, each word precise and cold. He asked if she knew who she had just touched, if she understood what happened to people who approached his son without permission. Chioma's scholarship, her visa, her entire future flashed before her eyes as she realized she hadn't asked a lonely boy to dance. She had touched the untouchable son of a man whose name was whispered in fear throughout Seoul's underground. The private office smelled of leather and threat. Chioma sat in a chair that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition, her hands trembling in her lap while the man called Kang Minho stood behind his massive desk, speaking rapid Korean into his phone. His son, Jiho, sat in another chair across the room, back to his routine of tapping patterns only he could hear. 3 hours had passed since the gala. 3 hours of being driven through Seoul's dark streets in a convoy of black cars, of being led through a building that felt more like a fortress than an office, of watching men with guns treat this terrifying stranger like a king. Her phone had been taken, her identification confiscated, and every attempt to explain or apologize had been met with stone-cold silence. When Miho finally ended his call and turned those merciless eyes on her, Chioma forced herself to sit straighter, channeling every ounce of her mother's strength. She wasn't raised to cower, even when fear threatened to choke her. She repeated what she tried to say all night, that she hadn't known, that she worked with special needs children back in Lagos, that she only wanted to help Jiho feel less alone. Miho listened without expression, then asked a question that made her blood run cold. He wanted to know how much her life was worth, what price she would place on walking away from this room alive. The words hung in the air like a blade, and Chioma understood she was dealing with a man who killed without hesitation, who had built an empire on violence and fear. But then something unexpected happened. Jiho spoke for the first time. His voice soft and measured, speaking in English clearly meant for her to understand. He told his father that the woman had been kind, that her voice was gentle like his mother's used to be, that the dance had made him feel calm in a way he rarely experienced at events. Miho's jaw clenched, and Chioma saw a flash of something human cross his face before the mask returned. He studied her for a long moment, and she met his gaze despite the terror coursing through her veins, despite knowing this man could end her existence with a single word to his men waiting outside. Miho walked around his desk, each step deliberate, until he stood before her. He explained in that dangerously quiet voice that his son's condition made him vulnerable, that enemies had tried to use Jiho before, that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Then he presented her with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She could return to her life, her scholarship, her plans, and simply disappear one night when his people came for her, or she could accept his alternative. He needed someone to care for Jiho, someone educated in his needs but unknown to his enemies, someone his son had actually connected with. She would live in his home, attend to Jiho's needs, and in exchange, her debt would be paid. Her visa would be extended indefinitely. Her mother would receive money every month. And when Jiho no longer needed her, she would be free to go with enough wealth to build any future she wanted. Chioma asked how long, and Miho's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. He said until he decided she'd earned her life back, which could be 6 months or 6 years. She had 60 seconds to choose. Her mind raced through impossible calculations, weighing her dreams against her survival, her freedom against her family's needs. She thought of her mother selling her gold jewelry to pay for that plane ticket, of her little brother who needed medical care they couldn't afford, of the fact that this terrifying man was offering her a fortune for doing what she'd studied to do anyway. When she finally nodded, accepting his devil's bargain, Miho's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. He told her she would start tomorrow, that someone would collect her belongings from her dormitory, that from this moment forward, her life belonged to him. As security escorted her to what would become her new room in his compound, Chioma wondered if she'd just made a deal with the devil or if somehow, impossibly, this was the answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to speak aloud. The Kang estate was a fortress disguised as luxury. Chioma's quarters were larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with 3 roommates, complete with a bedroom, private bathroom, and sitting area overlooking gardens maintained with military precision. But the beauty couldn't mask the reality of armed guards at every entrance, security cameras tracking her every movement, and the suffocating awareness that she lived at the mercy of a man who ruled Seoul's underworld. Her first week passed in a blur of routine, learning Jiho's schedule, his triggers, his safe spaces. The young man responded to her with a trust that both warmed and terrified her, as if that single dance had created a bond his isolated life desperately craved. Miho watched everything. She felt his presence even when he wasn't visible, knew he received reports about every interaction, every word exchanged. He appeared at unexpected moments, testing her, she realized, seeing if she would hurt his son or try to escape or prove to be the threat he expected. Chioma treated these encounters with careful respect, never pushing, never prying, maintaining the professional distance of someone who understood she was staff, not family, certainly not anything more. But she noticed things about the man beneath the monster reputation. The way his voice softened fractionally when speaking to Jiho. The weight he carried in those rare unguarded moments when he thought no one was watching. The loneliness that mirrored his son's, just wrapped in violence instead of vulnerability. 3 weeks in, everything shifted. Jiho had a meltdown triggered by unexpected construction noise outside, and nothing Chioma tried could reach him through the sensory overload. Miho appeared within minutes, summoned by her desperate call, and she watched him transform. He didn't bark orders or show frustration. Instead, he dropped to his knees beside his son, pulling Jiho into a firm but gentle hold, rocking slowly while humming something low and rhythmic. It took 20 minutes, but gradually Jiho's breathing slowed. His rigid body relaxed, and he fell asleep against his father's chest. When Miho finally looked up at Chioma, she saw exhaustion and fear that no amount of power could erase, and she realized this dangerous man loved his son with a ferocity that made her heart ache. She spoke without thinking, telling him in her mother's voice that he was a good father, that Jiho was lucky to have someone who understood him so completely. Miho's expression shuttered immediately, but not before she caught his surprise. He carried Jiho to his bedroom, and when he returned, he did something unprecedented. He asked Chioma to join him for dinner, not as staff but as someone who deserved his time. Over a meal prepared by his private chef, he began to talk, sharing pieces of his story in that controlled way of his. He told her about Jiho's mother, about losing her to illness when their son was only 5, about building his empire partially to ensure Jiho would always be protected, always have resources for whatever care he needed. He admitted that violence came easier than vulnerability, that trusting anyone outside his organization felt like exposing his throat to wolves. Chioma listened, really listened, the way she'd been taught to honor people's truths back home. Then she shared her own story, about growing up in Lagos with a single mother who worked 3 jobs, about her brother's diagnosis and the lack of resources that made every day a battle, about choosing nursing because she'd seen firsthand how much difference one person's compassion could make. She told him about the guilt of leaving Nigeria, of pursuing her dreams while her family struggled, of the debt she carried that had nothing to do with his threats and everything to do with survival. When their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared burdens, of understanding what it meant to love someone you'd sacrifice anything to protect. Miho said goodnight with something almost like warmth in his voice, and Chioma returned to her room with her heart beating too fast, aware that the lines between captor and captive, employer and employee, had just blurred in ways that terrified her more than any weapon he carried. 2 months became 3, and Chioma's temporary arrangement began to feel permanent in ways that had nothing to do with her contract. Jiho thrived under her care, achieving milestones his previous caregivers had deemed impossible. He started expressing himself more, even attempting social interactions at therapy sessions, and the pride in Miho's eyes when his son showed progress was beautiful to witness. But the real change was happening between Chioma and the man she was supposed to fear. Their dinners became routine, conversations deepening from surface courtesy to genuine connection. She learned about the boy he'd been before violence claimed him, about dreams abandoned for family duty, about the weight of controlling an empire built on fear. He learned about her passion for helping others, her homesickness for Lagos's chaos and warmth, her secret dream of opening a care facility back home that would serve children like her brother. The attraction built slowly, then all at once. Chioma tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened when Miho entered a room, the way his rare smiles felt like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, the way his careful distance from her felt less like disinterest and more like restraint. She reminded herself daily that this man was dangerous, that his hands had ended lives, that wanting him was insanity wrapped in self-destruction. But desire didn't listen to logic, and loneliness didn't care about consequences. She caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that made her skin burn, saw the way his jaw clenched when his men stood too close, noticed how his casual touches lingering when they reviewed Jiho's progress reports grew more frequent. The breaking point came on a humid night when Seoul's summer heat made sleep impossible. Chioma found Miho on the estate's rooftop garden, sleepless and drinking whiskey while staring at the city he controlled through fear. She should have retreated, maintained boundaries, but instead she sat beside him without asking permission. They talked for hours, words flowing easier in darkness, admitting truths daylight wouldn't allow. He confessed that she'd become important to him beyond her role with Jiho, that he hadn't felt this human in years, that her presence made his fortress feel like a home. She admitted that she'd stopped seeing him as her captor weeks ago, that his complexity fascinated her, that leaving when her debt was paid felt more like punishment than freedom. The kiss happened inevitably, naturally. His hand cupping her face while his thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Chioma tasted whiskey and want and years of loneliness matching her own, felt the tremor in his touch that spoke of restraint barely maintained. When they finally pulled apart, Miho's voice was rough with emotion as he warned her that loving him came with dangers her kind heart couldn't imagine, that his enemies would use her without hesitation, that this path led only to pain. She responded with her mother's fierce courage, telling him that she'd already danced with danger the night she took Jiho's hand, that she wasn't fragile, that she chose this with eyes wide open. His control shattered, and he kissed her again, harder, claiming and surrendering simultaneously. They made it to his bedroom in a tangle of need and consequence, and Chioma learned that the monster everyone feared made love with reverence that broke her heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. Afterward, lying in sheets that smelled of his cologne and their passion, reality crashed back. Miho held her close, his heartbeat steady against her cheek, but she felt the tension returning to his body. He told her that crossing this line had changed everything, that his enemies would know within days, that he needed to protect her in ways that might feel like prison. Chioma tilted her face up to meet his eyes, seeing the fear he couldn't quite hide, and promised she understood the risks. But as she drifted towards sleep in the dangerous safety of his arms, feeling more at home than she had since leaving Lagos, neither of them knew that someone within his organization had already betrayed them, that photographs from the rooftop were already being delivered to rivals who'd been waiting years for Kang Minho to expose a weakness they could exploit. The war for their impossible love was about to begin, and the battlefield would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and what happens when a Nigerian woman's stubborn heart collides with a Korean Mafia boss's need to protect what's his at any cost. The attack came at dawn, swift and brutal, and aimed precisely where Miho was most vulnerable. His rivals didn't want him dead, they wanted him destroyed, and they understood that meant taking the woman who'd somehow become his entire world in just 4 months. Chioma woke to gunfire and shouting, to Miho already dressed and armed, barking orders in Korean while his eyes promised violence to anyone who touched her. He moved her and Jiho to the estate's panic room, a reinforced bunker beneath the gardens. His kiss goodbye tasting of desperation and fury. Through security monitors, Chioma watched the man she loved become the monster everyone feared, efficient and merciless as he eliminated threats with a precision that had built his empire. The siege lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of Chioma holding Jiho, keeping him calm despite the terror clawing at her throat, singing Nigerian lullabies her mother once sang to her while praying to every god she knew that Miho would survive. When silence finally fell and the bunker door opened, he stood there covered in blood, none of which was his own, looking at her with eyes that held too much death and too much love. His first words were asking if she was hurt, if Jiho was safe, and when she confirmed they were fine, she watched his legendary control crack. He pulled her into his arms with a force that stole her breath, his body shaking with the aftershock of almost losing what mattered most. The aftermath revealed harsh truths. 3 of his inner circle were dead, traitors who'd sold information for promises of power. His organization had lost significant ground, and rivals sensed weakness in a king who'd shown he'd burn his empire to protect one woman. Miho's advisors demanded he send Chioma away, argued that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, insisted that caring for anyone made him vulnerable. She heard them through his office door, heard them calculate her life in terms of strategic liability. When Miho finally emerged, his face was stone, and Chioma prepared herself for heartbreak disguised as protection. Instead, he told her he was offering her a choice, a real one this time. He could arrange her safe return to Nigeria with enough money to build 10 care facilities, could ensure her family wanted for nothing, could give her the future she'd dreamed of before one dance changed everything. His voice stayed level, but his hands clenched into fists, and she saw the cost of that offer written in every rigid line of his body. The alternative was staying, accepting that loving him meant danger and difficulty, understanding that his enemies would always target her, knowing that their life together would be built on foundations of violence he couldn't escape. He told her he was selfish enough to want her to stay but loved her enough to let her go, and the choice was entirely hers. Chioma looked at this impossible man, this killer with a father's tender heart, this king who'd bow to no one except her. She thought of her mother's voice telling her that love wasn't found in safety but in someone worth facing danger beside. She thought of Jiho's progress, of the child she'd grown to love as her own. She thought of Lagos's sunshine versus Seoul's complexity, of dreams deferred versus dreams redefined. Then she closed the distance between them, took Miho's scarred hands in her brown ones, and told him in English colored by Yoruba rhythm that she'd already made her choice that first night, that dancing with his son had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She explained that strength wasn't avoiding danger but standing firm despite it, that her mother hadn't raised a daughter who ran when things got difficult, that she loved him with every stubborn piece of her heart. Miho's kiss tasted of relief and promise and forever. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her the way she'd once spun with Jiho, and when he set her down, his smile was real and unguarded and beautiful. He admitted he'd been preparing to follow her to Lagos if she'd chosen to leave, that ruling Seoul meant nothing without her, that she'd conquered him more completely than any rival ever could. They stood together in his office, African queen and Korean king, already planning their future. Miho would restructure his organization, moving toward legitimate business while maintaining enough edge to keep them protected. Chioma would complete her nursing degree with his support, then they'd establish the care facility she'd dreamed of, splitting time between Seoul and Lagos. Jiho would have both the father he needed and the mother figure he'd chosen, stability built on love instead of duty. 6 months later, Chioma stood in a traditional Korean hanbok beside Miho in his perfectly tailored suit, Jiho beaming between them as they celebrated their wedding with a fusion of cultures that honored both their worlds. Her mother flew in from Lagos, embracing the dangerous son-in-law who'd promised to cherish her daughter with the same fierce devotion he showed his empire. The compound that had once felt like a prison had transformed into a home, filled with Chioma's colorful African textiles mixing with Korean minimalism, with Jiho's artwork covering walls once bare, with love that proved stronger than fear. When Miho pulled his wife close for their first dance as husband and wife, swaying to music that blended Afrobeat with traditional Korean drums, Chioma remembered that night at the gala when one act of kindness had changed everything. She'd asked the wrong boy to dance and ended up in his father's bed, in his heart, in his life. Some mistakes, she thought as Miho whispered his love in her ear, were actually destiny wearing a disguise. Their story proved that love recognizes no borders, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is exactly who a brave woman's heart needs. From one dance to forever, from captor to partner, from African sunshine meeting Korean steel, they built something unbreakable. And when their children asked years later how their parents met, Chioma and Miho would exchange knowing smiles before telling the tale of one dance that sparked a love powerful enough to reshape an empire. Did this story captivate you? Did Chioma and Miho's impossible love keep you watching until the very end? If you're craving more romance stories that break boundaries and challenge everything you thought you knew about love, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell because we're bringing you more cross-cultural romances, more dangerous love stories, and more tales of brave hearts that refuse to play it safe. Comment below which part made your heart race the fastest, and don't forget to like this video if you're Team Chioma and Miho forever. Your support helps us create more stories that celebrate love in all its beautiful, complicated, dangerous forms. Subscribe now and let's continue this journey together.